Doesn't it feel strange that it's been 2 years since the release of Mordhau? I know, right? The first-person medieval slasher has really been through the works when it comes to its player-based mechanics and new updates. And oh my, recently have we got some exciting new features confirmed and maybe even an expansion along the line. So, without further ado, let's look into the future, but also the past of Mordhau 2 years later. Mordhau began on the 29th of April 2019. It was released to a bit of fanfare, and that's to say the least. A new IP from a completely new studio selling over 200,000 copies within its first week. That is something else. Especially a new IP getting something above 60,000 current players within its first few weeks. It was one of the most popular games on Steam at the time, and for a medieval genre game, that wasn't that common back then. I mean, we had Mount and Blade Warband, which was a stay in the community that people still loved and people still play to this day, but it never reached those numbers. We also had the Total War games, which has sort of gone off on a different direction, and of course Kingdom Come Deliverance was pretty successful in its own right. But until 2019, nothing had really reached that mainstream gauge in the medieval community like Mordhau did. Of course, since then we've had some historical titles like Valheim or Mount and Blade 2 Bannerlord that has sent it off into the stratosphere, but Mordhau was really the first that got to that level, being very heavily influenced by Chivalry from the past that was released in 2012, and even a game like War of the Roses. Mordhau brought completely refined, skilled, and in-depth first-person sword-based combat. It had been so long since we got a new medieval game, and I think people were just waiting for something like Mordhau, with some amazing frontline modes like on the camp map, or going into mountain peaks, pushing a battering ramp up to the gate. These have later been expanded upon, with the mountain peaks map now getting an extra section, pushing through the gate and into the courtyard, and then into the final keep of that castle. I don't know if many of you have been around this channel for that long, but when that map came out and the initial release of Mordhau, I mentioned that Mountain Peaks could do something different, that there's the potential that it could go further. You see, we had this battering ram that would end the game once the attackers had knocked down the initial gates, and I said in a video back in the day that maybe they could do something extra with that. Maybe they could expand it to another bit of map. And just over a year later, they actually added it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I had any say in that happening, but I just think it's awesome how they've expanded it through the games. We also got the Crossroads map, a map that came in a few months after the initial release of Mordhau. Whilst it was new and something a bit different, I think it wasn't the most popular at the time, since it didn't have that more linear frontline mode, something that was incredibly popular with the community. It focused more on the outside, with cavalry battles, jousting and spikes everywhere. It added in the mortar, which was just a team-killing machine, yes, even more than the catapult, but also a more team deathmatch style game mode, where you'd go in and just try and get as many kills as possible, and it kind of diminished a bit of the team play. Whilst it was popular with a lot of people, I would say the Crossroads was pretty good at the start, but people started to move away from it back to the regular maps of Camp, Grad, Mountain Peaks. Later on, we got what I personally was really waiting for, a siege mode in Mordhau, and this came in the form of the new map Feiteria. Feiteria was not necessarily your standard typical Mount and Blade like multiplayer siege, but it brought in those elements with massive walls, horse stables, big drawbridges, and gates. The attackers would start in a camp and the defenders would have to rush out and sally forth to try and stop them in their tracks. But if this failed, then it was the siege tower's turn to come under attack. The attackers would have to push it up to the walls and the defenders would have to try and get as many flaming torches on it as possible to try and burn it down. Then it was an all-out war within the castle, on the walls in the keep, going down the stairs and into the village, before finally finishing off at the docks if the defenders were pushed back that far. It added in awesome things like rocks that you could throw upon the enemy, and of course it gave such a different feel to the game. It used the new invasion mode, which was similar to Frontline but a more attack and defend, rather than Frontline, which is a very much two-sided affair. And this brought us through to the next stages of Mordhau's life, with a new map, Castello. Now, when Castello was released, this was when Mordhau was going through a different stage. You see, Feiteria was just about the end of when Mordhau was starting to die off in its massive boom of popularity. Don't get me wrong, it's still beloved to this day and there's still plenty of people that play it, but we're talking about from its initial release with its 60,000 concurrent players. When Feiteria came out, it was around to 20 to 30,000 concurrent players, and of course that boosted it to no end. But Castello came about a year after the actual release. This came along with that expansion to Mountain Peaks that I talked about earlier in this video, and yes, it gave a bit of a boost to the player base, but I thought there was a lot of mixed reviews about the Castello map. It was another urban city map, but it wasn't really as siegey as Feiteria was, and it wasn't quite as open and flowing as something like Camp was. You see, it was kind of stuck in the middle, and it had some really cool features like a lot of vertical gameplay. It went from the very lower levels of the docks up into the high rafters of the keep and the castle that was being fought in, using ladders to go between, dropping rocks on people, and I think it was a really cool, unique take. However, it wasn't the most popular. However, in the latest Mordhau update in early April, we got some really cool reforms to the Castello map, adding in a new frontline mode where one of the stages was bombing the enemy ships with mortars, and god, is that a lot of fun. But also the addition of the partisan spear, a new weapon that merged between melee combat and ranged, being able to throw it but also getting a few good stabs in there at the same time. But throughout the years, it's done very well. The developers have done a fantastic job of keeping it updated, but also the community. We've seen mods pretty much from the very start. About a year since the release, we actually got modding tools, and that's when it really started to go full ahead. One of the most recent ones that I've been taking a look at is the Lord of the Rings mods. And the fantastic thing about modding in Mordhau is you don't have to do anything to get into it. There's no third-party website to download it. There's no external installations. You just find a server that's got a mod on that you think you might like, and you click join, and it all downloads for you. And I think that is the best way that they could possibly do modding in this game. But the Lord of the Rings maps have been incredible. There's full servers dedicated towards it. Horde modes defending Helm's Deep, Osgiliath. Oh my, it is so much fun. I made a full dedicated video on that a few weeks ago, so if you haven't already, make sure you go and check it out. But if you've played in the past a mod like Full Invasion 2 for Mount & Blade Warband, where you and your friends would stand on the walls of the Hornburg and defending against waves and waves of Aurochs and Orcs, this has been brought to Mordhau, and it is just as fun as you might imagine. There's also some Star Wars mods that I've been bought in. I haven't actually had the time to go and check them out myself, but there's plenty of gameplay on YouTube of people playing these, and the Star Wars mods look so well detailed, and it looks like it had so much effort put into it, and it is done impeccably well. But what is the future of Mordhau? Now, of course, the modern community will always be churning things out, bringing us new eras, time periods, weapons, and of course, everything that you could want. But the actual development of the game is going in a very exciting direction. I did mention at the beginning of this video there are possibly some hints of future updates and possibly a full expansion. If anyone was around in the very early days of Mordhau, it was a Kickstarter. This Kickstarter needed $80,000 in order to get the funding for the game to be released. Of course, it got that. So once they got that, they decided to bring in some new stretch goals. You know, the sort of thing, 100,000 will bring in modding tools, 200,000 will bring in custom servers, that sort of thing. But $365,000-ish was the Eastern Invasion expansion. Now, unfortunately, that was never hit in the Kickstarter, but because of the massive success of Mordhau's release, Eastern Invasion is on its way. Whether this is just a small update or a full expansion, I guess we'll only tell when it's released, but it looks like we're going to get a lot of cool things. Of course, your generic new armors and weapons. One of the most notably is going to be the scimitar. Whether it's going to be a one- or two-handed weapon, that's still to be seen, but of course, you know it's going to be just as annoying as the rapier. There's also been hints of getting multiple new maps coming in. We've had a few screenshots of a map that's supposedly called Nerea, so I think this one is most likely confirmed due to these screenshots. This seems to be a more deserty urban environment, fighting through the streets in some southern cities. But I've heard that they're potentially thinking of adding more in with this expansion, which could be very exciting. And one of the final things that they mentioned is that Mordhau will be coming to console. I'm assuming this means Xbox and PS4 because, of course, you know, it's probably too difficult to port this thing to the Switch. But in terms of expanding its audience, this can only be positive. Unfortunately, unlike Chivalry 2, they said it's most likely not going to be crossplay, because you have to remember, Torn Banner, who are making Chivalry 2 at the moment, who have confirmed crossplay for that game, they're a much more veteran studio. They've been around for a long time, and they have more resources. Criterion, who make Mordhau, they're still verging on an indie studio. It's probably much harder for their size of studio to get a game to crossplay, so I wouldn't hold out seeing that in the near future. But let me know what you think. What are you most exciting for? What are your best memories for Mordhau throughout the last 2 years? What have been your favorite updates, and what have been the ones that you've not been so keen on? But what about the future? Are you looking forward to the Eastern expansion, and are you going to pick it up on console? Please let me know in the comments down below. But leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, leave a dislike if you didn't. Until then, I will see you in the next one.